On August 15th, 1872, Henrik Solberg stood on 40 acres of stumps with $4 in his pocket and a dead wife buried 300 miles away. The neighbors called his land the graveyard of fools. They called the house he would build the woodpile. They bet money he would be frozen stiff by Christmas. 5 months later, when the thermometer at the Oconto Railroad Station read 41 below zero and the wind tore the roof off a barn built by 20 men in 3 days, Henrik Solberg was sitting by a stove in a house made of firewood, teaching a stray dog to sit. This is how it happened. The land had been promised in a railroad pamphlet. 40 acres, $12, good soil, a new beginning for any man willing to work. What the pamphlet did not say was that the Knapstout Lumber Company had spent 3 years stripping every white pine worth cutting from this corner of Oconto County. What the pamphlet did not show was the battlefield left behind. Stumps jutting from the earth every 10 feet, some as wide as a man's arm span. Brush tangled between them, thick with bramble and scrub maple. Popple suckers no thicker than a wrist. Cedar twisted by wind into shapes no sawmill would accept. Oak stumps that would take a week each to grub out. Henrik walked his 40 acres that first afternoon with the dog at his heels. He was looking for what a man needed to build a cabin. Straight logs, 12 to 20 feet long, thick enough to notch and stack. The kind of logs every settler used. The kind every cabin required. He found none. The loggers had taken everything straight. What they left behind was crooked, knotty, forked, short. There was wood everywhere on his 40 acres, more wood than he could burn in 10 winters, but not a single tree he could use to build a cabin. He had 8 weeks until the first hard freeze. The dog had appeared 3 days earlier at the edge of the lumber camp where Henrik was sleeping under a wagon. A Norwegian elk hound, gray-coated and thick-furred, with one back leg gashed by something with teeth. The hunters passing through had lost him and had not come back. Henrik cleaned the wound with creek water and fed the dog half his breakfast bacon. By the second morning, the dog would not leave his side. Henrik named him Bjorn, which meant bear in the language of his grandfather, and when he walked out of the lumber camp with everything he owned in a canvas sack, the dog walked with him. Henrik had not always been poor. 5 years earlier, he had stepped off a ship in Milwaukee with his wife Ingrid and $200 saved from 3 years of fishing off the Norwegian coast. They had plans. A farm, children. A life in this new country where land was cheap and a man could own what he worked. Ingrid had laughed at everything that first year, even the mosquitoes, even the cold. She had black hair and a scar on her chin from a fishing hook when she was 9, and she spoke English like she was trying on a dress that did not quite fit. The lumber mill in Menominee was hiring. Henrik took the job, planned to work 2 years, save enough for land and equipment. He was strong. The work was brutal. 12-hour days feeding logs into the saw, but he did not complain. By the spring of 1871, he had nearly $200 in the bank of Menominee, enough to start. Then Ingrid caught typhoid. She died in July of 1872 in a boarding house that smelled of lye soap and fever. The doctor cost $18. The burial cost $12 more. Henrik held her hand until it went cold, then walked back to the mill to work his shift because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant he could not survive. 2 months later, the panic hit. The Bank of Menominee failed on September 3rd. Henrik's remaining savings, $147, vanished overnight. The mill shut down the same week. No one was buying lumber when the whole country was collapsing. In the space of 60 days, Henrik lost his wife, his money, and his work. What he had left was his tools, his body, and $12 he had kept in his boot rather than the bank. He bought 40 acres of cut-over land from the railroad. It was the cheapest land in Wisconsin, and now, standing on it, he understood why. Bjorn sat at his side, ears pricked, watching a crow pick at something in a stump hole. The wind moved through the brush and made a dry, rattling sound, like old paper. Henrik tried to imagine Ingrid standing here beside him and could not. She had never seen this land. She had never seen any land. He had buried her in a pauper's grave without a headstone because $12 had been all he could afford. And now the $12 had bought him this. He did not cry. He had used up that capacity months ago. What he did instead was start walking toward the only other farm within 4 miles, because a man with $4 and no knowledge of Wisconsin winters needed advice before he needed anything else. Halvor Knudsen's place was everything Henrik's was not. A proper cabin with hewn logs and tight chinking and glass windows. A barn, a smokehouse. Split-rail fences marking out fields already cleared of stumps. Knudsen had been in Wisconsin since 1858. He had survived 14 winters and buried 2 brothers to the cold of 1869, the winter that also cost him 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite. In the original telling of this story, the hard man was called Knudsen. Here, we will call him by his true name as it was written on the land deed at the Oconto County Courthouse. Thorvald Knudsen, 55 years old, broad across the shoulders, face weathered to leather by 15 years of Wisconsin wind. Henrik found him mending harness in the dooryard. Bjorn stayed close at Henrik's hip. The dog had learned already that strange men could be dangerous. Thorvald listened to Henrik explain his situation. The 40 acres, the $4, the question of how a man built a cabin alone. Then Thorvald laughed. It was not cruel laughter. It was the weary laugh of a man watching someone walk toward a cliff. "You have no logs," Thorvald said. "I have seen that land. The company took everything worth taking. What remains is fit for firewood, nothing else." "There must be a way," Henrik said. "Men have built cabins with less. Men have died with more." Thorvald set down the harness. His hands were thick with scar tissue. "A cabin requires logs 12 feet long at minimum, straight as a rifle barrel, or the walls will not seat. I see nothing but stumps and brush on your 40 acres. Where will you find logs?" "I can buy them, have them hauled." "With what money?" "Mill lumber costs $3 per 100 board feet. You would need $500 in materials to build what I built. And then you would need men. 20 men, 3 days to raise my walls. Walls must go up fast before the logs settle and bind. A man alone cannot lift a 12-foot log above his waist. Even if you had the timber, you could not raise it." Henrik said nothing. The numbers were the numbers. Thorvald studied him, saw the worn clothes, the hollow cheeks, the calloused hands. "How much money do you have?" $4. Another laugh, this one bitter. $4 will not buy glass for a single window. $4 will not buy nails for a door frame. A man cannot build a cabin for $4. "Then what do I do?" A woman stepped out of the cabin then. She was carrying a tin cup and a blue-speckled coffee pot, and she moved like someone who had spent her life bringing men hot drinks whether they had asked for one or not. Gerda Knudsen, 50 years old, with silver threading through dark hair pulled back tight. She poured coffee into the cup and placed it in Henrik's hand without asking whether he wanted it. "Drink," she said. "You walked 4 miles." Henrik drank. The coffee was strong and bitter and hotter than anything his body had felt in weeks. Gerda looked at her husband, then at Henrik. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds over a lake. "My husband," she said quietly, "buries his words in frost. But his heart is not cold. He only speaks hard because he has seen too much." She walked back into the cabin without waiting for a reply. Thorvald watched her go with an expression Henrik could not read. "You go back to Menominee," Thorvald said when she was gone. "You find work in a mill, a shop, anywhere. You spend the winter earning money, and next spring you come back with enough to do this properly, or—" He paused. "You dig a dugout, a hole in a hillside roofed with logs and sod. Men have survived winters in dugouts. Not comfortably, not safely. But they have survived. And if I build a cabin anyway?" Thorvald's expression did not change. "Then you will die out there. A man alone cannot raise walls before the freeze. You have 8 weeks. You have no logs, no help, and no money. The math does not lie. He picked up the harness again. Thread and needle. The conversation was over. "I knew a man like you," he said without looking up. "Stubborn, proud. Arrived in '68 with nothing and would not listen to anyone. Built a shanty from brush and bark. Said he would improve it come spring." He looked up one last time. "A man alone cannot raise walls before the freeze. You will die out there, and no one will find your body until spring." Henrik walked back to his 40 acres in silence. 4 miles through cut-over land. Stumps and brush and the wreckage of what had once been forest. Thorvald's words circled in his head like crows. No logs, no help, no money. 8 weeks. Now let me ask you something before we go further. If you had $4 and 8 weeks before winter, and the only man within 4 miles told you to dig a hole in the ground and pray, would you listen to him? Or would you try something nobody had ever done? Think about that while the story continues. Because Henrik's answer is about to change everything. He had been a fool to come here. A fool to think that land alone was enough. Land without resources was just a place to starve. But where else could he go? Menominee was full of men looking for work that did not exist. Milwaukee was worse. He had no family in America, no one to take him in. Ingrid was dead. His savings were gone. This 40 acres of stumps and brush was all he had. He could dig a dugout. Thorvald had said men survived in dugouts. A hole in a hillside, dark, damp, close to the earth, like a grave you lived in until spring. Henrik stopped walking. He was standing at the edge of his land where he had stacked firewood against a stump 2 days earlier. Short rounds of cedar, 12 to 16 inches long, split and piled to dry. Firewood. The one thing his land had in abundance. The stack was perhaps 4 feet high, 3 feet wide. He had covered it with bark slabs to keep off the rain. Bjorn trotted up to the stack and sat down. The dog looked at the stack, then at Henrik, then back at the stack. He barked once. A short, sharp sound, as if he were pointing at something. Henrik looked at the woodpile as if he had never seen it before. The rounds were stable. They had not shifted or tumbled despite 3 days of rain and wind. The cut ends faced outward, and where rain had hit them, the water had beaded and run off rather than soaking in. The bark side of the wood, if he had stacked it that direction, would have absorbed the rain. But the cut ends shed it. He thought of his grandfather's stories. In the Setesdal Valley of Norway, high in the mountains where logs were scarce and winters killed men who did not plan, poor farmers had built walls from chunks of wood stacked with clay between them. Kubhus, his grandfather had called it. Chunk wall building. The old man had seen one such building as a child, said it had stood for 50 years. Said his own grandfather had built it, and his great-grandfather before him. The knowledge had crossed the sea with Henrik. He had forgotten it because it had never been useful to him before. Now, standing in Cutover, Wisconsin with $4 in his pocket, it was the only useful thing he owned. Henrik pulled a round from the stack. It weighed perhaps 15 pounds. He could lift it easily with one hand. A 12-foot cabin log weighed 300 pounds or more. It required 4 men to carry, 20 men to raise into a wall. This round weighed 15 pounds. He could carry 100 of them in a day. He looked at his land again. The stumps, the brush, the crooked, knotty, twisted timber that no logger would touch, the cedar scrub, the popple suckers, the short, worthless wood that covered every acre. Worthless for cabin logs, but not worthless for this. His heart began to beat faster. He saw it now, not the land's poverty, but its possibility. He did not need 12-foot logs. He did not need 20 men. He did not need anything he could not do alone. He needed short rounds, mortar, and a frame to hold it all together. The rounds he had. Thousands of them, everywhere he looked. Mortar required lime. Lime came from limestone. And 3 days earlier, walking his boundary line, he had seen limestone outcroppings along the creek. Gray stone jutting from the hillside, free for the taking. Burn limestone with wood and you get quicklime. Slake quicklime with water and you get lime. Mix lime with sand and sawdust and you get mortar. He had seen masons do it. He had watched bricklayers in Menominee build walls that would outlast any log cabin. A wall of short rounds stacked like bricks, mortared in place, cut ends facing out to shed rain. Mortar sealing every gap. No chinking to fail. No wind to penetrate. The rounds could be any length he chose. If he cut them 16 inches long, his walls would be 16 inches thick. 16 inches of wood and mortar. What would that hold? How much cold could 16 inches stop? He did not know. No one he had ever met had built such a thing. But he knew what the alternative was. Dugout or death. Thorvald had made that clear. This was a third option. Uncertain. Untested. Possibly fatal. But his. Bjorn barked again. Henrik knelt and put his arms around the dog's neck and pressed his forehead against the thick gray fur. "You'll see, Bjorn," he whispered. "We'll both see." 4 days later, Henrik walked into a Kanto to buy roofing nails. He had 53 cents left after the purchase, and a 3-mile walk back with the nails rattling in his pocket like small bells. The general store was run by a man named Cornelius Lindstrom, 45 years old, thick through the middle, with a gold ring on his right hand and a face that flushed red when he laughed. He was laughing when Henrik walked in. A joke among 6 other men, all of them holding coffee or tobacco or glasses of something that was not coffee. Henrik counted his nails at the counter. The laughter stopped. "You are the Norwegian," Cornelius said. "The one who bought the old cutover." "I am. I heard what you plan to build." Cornelius smiled wide enough to show a gold-capped tooth. "Firewood walls, a house made of kindling." Henrik said nothing. He counted out his coins. "I will make you an offer," Cornelius said. $8 for your 40 acres. Today, cash. You walk back to Menominee with enough to find a boarding house through the winter. No shame in it. A man must eat. Henrik did not look up. "I paid 12. "You paid too much. The land is worthless. Everyone knows this. But I am a generous man." Cornelius turned to his audience. The 6 men watched with the careful attention of people who smelled entertainment. "In fact, I will make a wager. Any man in this room. $5 says the Norwegian's woodpile collapses before Christmas. $10 says he is dead by February." 3 men reached for their pockets. Cornelius beamed. One man did not laugh. He was tall and lean, 40 years old, with a face like a well-maintained fence post. Einar Dahlberg. He had been standing near the door with a sack of flour at his feet. "I take that bet, Lindstrom," Einar said. $5 says the man is still breathing come March." The room went quiet. Cornelius looked at Einar the way a cat looks at another cat in the same alley. "Your money, Dahlberg. I will enjoy spending it." Einar nodded once, picked up his flour, and walked out. Henrik finished counting his nails. He still had not looked up. $8, Cornelius said softly. "Final offer, Norwegian. Tomorrow it becomes 6. By December it becomes nothing because the county will take your land for back taxes after they find your body." Henrik gathered his nails. He turned toward the door. "Your dog," Cornelius called after him. "I will buy the dog for $1 when they find your body. He looks like a good hunting dog." Henrik stopped. He turned. He looked at Cornelius Lindstrom for the first time, and his voice was so quiet the men had to lean forward to hear it. "You will not touch the dog." Then he walked out into the September sunlight. Bjorn was waiting at the hitching post. Together they walked the 3 miles home. By the end of September, Henrik had cut 600 rounds, built 4 cedar corner posts, and rigged a block and tackle from a high oak branch that allowed him to raise crossbeams weighing 300 pounds by himself, 1 inch at a time, using mechanical advantage his grandfather had taught him with the knot of a fishing rope. And the first frost whitened the grass. Henrik woke on the first day of October to find ice in the water bucket. Bjorn was pressed against his chest inside the canvas tent, shivering despite his thick coat. The dog had started doing this in late September, as if he understood that his body heat and Henrik's together equaled survival in a way that either alone did not. Henrik wrapped both arms around him and waited for the gray light outside to brighten enough for work. 30 days until hard freeze. 1,400 rounds still to cut. 4 walls to raise. And a lime kiln he had not yet built. The math said he would fail. The math had always said he would fail. He got up anyway. By the end of the first week of October, the south wall rose 4 feet high. The technique was simple once you understood it. Lay a bead of mortar along the foundation log. Set a round. Lay another bead on top of the round. Fill the center gap with sawdust mixed with a small amount of lime. Repeat. The mortar squelched and spread. The round settled into place. The wall grew, round by round, like a living thing. 8 square feet per day. That was Henrik's rate. At 8 square feet per day, he needed 40 days to complete all 4 walls. He had perhaps 30 days before hard freeze made mortar work impossible. Einar Dahlberg rode up on a swayback mare on the 5th of October. He said nothing for a long time. He circled the half-built wall, studying it. He touched the mortar with one finger and pulled his finger back dry. He looked at the rounds drying in rows beside the frame, at the lime kiln Henrik had built from stacked limestone and was preparing to fire for the first time, at Bjorn lying in the grass watching both men with his chin on his paws. "This is sound work," Einar said finally. "Better than my own." Henrik blinked. He had not heard a compliment in months. Einar dismounted. "I have a wife named Hannah. She lost 3 children to the measles in '68. She does not let people eat alone anymore. She says loneliness killed our children faster than the fever did." He opened a saddlebag and pulled out a cloth sack. Heavy. Lumpy. Potatoes, 20 pounds. Salt pork, 10. You repay in spring. Or not. Hannah insists. Henrik's throat tightened. He had not eaten well in weeks. His belt was cinched 3 notches tighter than when he had arrived. "Why?" he managed. Einar shrugged. "You are still alive. That means something." He mounted his horse, then paused. "Lindström is telling everyone your cabin will collapse. He has money on it. 6 men have bet with him. I am the only one who bet the other way." "Why?" Einar looked at the wall, touched the mortar again, nodded slowly. "Because I have hands, and I know what hands can do when a man has no other choice. Lindström has never been hungry. He does not understand." He rode away, and Bjorn watched him go, and Henrik stood with 20 pounds of potatoes in his arms and realized he had a friend in Oconto County. Now let me stop here for a moment, because something important just happened, and I want to make sure we see it together. Hannah Dahlberg, a woman we have not yet met, sent 20 pounds of potatoes to a man she had never spoken to, because she had buried 3 children and decided that no one else was going to starve alone on her watch. That is the kind of woman who builds a country. Have you ever been the receiver of a kindness like that from someone you had never even met? A kindness that showed up exactly when you needed it and could not ask for it? If you have, you know what Henrik felt holding those potatoes. Keep that memory close as this story continues, because kindness is going to matter before we are done. The lime kiln was a terror. Henrik built it from stacked limestone, layers of rock alternating with layers of cordwood, the whole pile 4 feet high and 6 feet wide. He lit it at dawn and fed it for 48 hours straight, sleeping in snatches between loadings. The limestone cracked and popped as it heated. White smoke poured from the gaps between stones. Not wood smoke, but something acrid, choking, that burned his throat and made his eyes stream. By the second night, the stones glowed red in the darkness, and the heat was so intense he could not approach within 10 feet. The first batch succeeded. So did the second. The third kiln failed. It rained for 3 days in mid-October. Cold, driving rain that turned the building site to mud and seeped into everything. Henrik had built the third kiln before the rain, planning to fire it during a dry spell. But the rain came instead, soaking the limestone, flooding the wood. The whole structure collapsed into a muddy heap. 2 days of work. Gone. 1/4 of his lime supply. Gone. Henrik stood in the ruins of the kiln, rain-soaked and exhausted, and felt something he had not felt since Ingrid died. Despair. The walls would not be finished in time. He would run out of mortar before he ran out of wall, and then the freeze would come, and the half-built cabin would stand as a monument to his failure. And Thorvald Knudsen would be right, and Cornelius Lindström would be right, and the 6 men who had bet against him would collect their $5 and laugh. Bjorn came and pressed against his leg. The dog made a sound deep in his chest. Not a whine, not a bark. Something closer to a groan. Henrik sat down in the mud and wrapped his arms around his dog. For the first time since Menominee, he let himself feel the full weight of it. $4. 40 acres of stumps. A wife buried in a grave he could not afford to mark with a stone. He had not been able to afford a headstone for Ingrid. He had meant to buy one once he had work, once he had savings, once he had anything. And then the bank had collapsed, and she had been dead for 2 months in an unmarked grave, and the shame of it was a weight he carried everywhere. He was going to fail her again. Then he thought of Cornelius Lindström's smile, the gold-capped tooth, the laughter of 6 men. The despair burned off, replaced by something hotter. He rebuilt the kiln that afternoon. Smaller this time. He used drier wood salvaged from the cabin frame scraps. He covered the whole structure with bark slabs to shed any rain. He fired it at dusk and sat up all night feeding it. Bjorn curled at his feet, the glow of the kiln reflecting in the dog's dark eyes. By dawn, he had lime. Not enough, but some. Father Gustav Olofsson came on a gray afternoon in mid-October. He was 60 years old, Lutheran, bearded to the sternum, and he arrived on a spotted mare that walked with her head low, like she had been making visits all morning and was tired of meeting new people. "I came," Father Gustav said carefully, "because the widow Bergquist mentioned you in prayer last Sunday. She said you lost a wife. I thought I would offer counsel." Henrik set down his trowel. Father Gustav walked around the structure. He touched one wall, pressed his hand flat against it, and pulled back as if he had been stung. "This," he said, "is not a cabin." "It will be, Father." "It is." The old priest searched for words. "I do not know what it is." He turned to Henrik. His face was kind and troubled in equal measure. "My son, the old ways from the old country do not always cross the sea. God gives us new lands, new ways. What your grandfather built in Norway may not be what you should build in Wisconsin. There is no shame in humility. There is no shame in asking the community for help. Pastor Larson at the Methodist Church has spoken to his congregation. They would raise a proper cabin for you. It would take 1 week. I have no money to pay them, Father. They would do it without payment. It is what Christians do." Henrik looked at the priest, at the kind, lined face, at the certainty of a man who had never been truly alone. "I thank you, Father, but I did not come to America to be a debt. I came to build. You will see." Father Gustav sighed. He mounted his horse. Before he rode away, he looked back. "I will ask the congregation to pray for you regardless. And Henrik, the widow Bergquist, if you ever wish to speak with her, she knows what it is to lose. She buried her husband to cholera in 71. She has 2 small children. She is a good woman. The priest rode away, and Henrik returned to his trowel. But he remembered the name, Bergquist. The 1st of November brought Henrik to Oconto for salt and to the Lutheran church because he did not know where else to go to give thanks for the mortar that was holding. The widow was there, Anna Bergquist, 34 years old, with hair the color of wheat at harvest and hands that had worked every day of her life. She was cleaning the candle holders when Henrik came in. 2 children sat on a bench by the door. A boy of 9 named Lars, serious-faced, reading a prayer book. A girl of 7 named Birgitta, with her mother's wheat hair and her mother's careful eyes. Bjorn walked in behind Henrik because Henrik had not thought to tell him to stay. Birgitta looked up from her bench. Her face transformed. She slid off the bench and walked toward Bjorn with her hand held out, palm down, the way someone had taught her to approach a strange dog. She was fearless in the particular way that small children sometimes are, the way that reminds adults what courage looks like before it learns to be careful. Bjorn sniffed her hand. He sat down. He let her stroke his ears. "Mama," Birgitta said, "the dog has sad eyes, like you." Anna Bergquist turned from the candles. Her face went pink, then pale, then composed. "Birgitta, we do not speak to strangers." "He's not a stranger. His dog told me." Henrik could not help it. He smiled. Anna saw the smile and looked away quickly, and her hands were unsteady on the candle holder. "I apologize for my daughter," she said to the floor. "She has opinions about everything." "Do not apologize for a good child." Their eyes met for a moment. Wheat fields in October light. She looked back at the candles. "I should go," Henrik said. "I only came to give thanks." "For what?" "For mortar that has not yet failed." He did not know why he said it. He walked out before she could reply, Bjorn at his heel, Birgitta watching them through the church door until they turned the corner. On the ride home, Henrik thought about wheat in October light and did not know what to do with the thought. Cornelius Lindstrom came to the cabin site on the 29th of October. He came with 3 other men, all of them his betters. They came in a wagon, all 4 of them drinking from the same bottle, and they stopped at the edge of the clearing and sat in their wagon and laughed. "Look at this, gentlemen. The Norwegian is still alive. And look what he has built, a woodpile, with dirt between the sticks." Henrik was mixing mortar. He did not look up. "Solberg," Cornelius called. "Final offer, $15 for your 40 acres. Today, cash in hand. You walk out of here with enough to start over somewhere that will not kill you." Henrik set down his trowel, stood slowly, wiped his hands on his trousers. "Not for sale. $15, man. You paid 12. That is $3 of profit for what is coming anyway." "Not for sale." Cornelius turned to his companions. "You see? A fool cannot be helped, can only be buried." He took a long drink from the bottle, wiped his mouth, looked at Bjorn, who had positioned himself between the wagon and Henrik, hackles raised along his spine. "Keep your mongrel back, Norwegian, or I will shoot it." Henrik went very still. "You will not touch the dog." "I own this county, Solberg. I will do what I please." Bjorn made a sound Henrik had never heard him make before. Low, long, a rolling growl that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The other 3 men in the wagon went silent. One of them put his hand on Cornelius's arm. "Corn, let's go. The dog is not worth it." Cornelius looked at Bjorn, at Henrik, at the strange textured wall that should not exist. He spat into the dirt. "February," he said. "February will sell your land for you, Norwegian. At auction, for back taxes. I will be there with cash, and I will buy your dog for $1 when they find your body." The wagon pulled away. Bjorn watched it all the way to the tree line, and then he walked over to Henrik and pressed his head against Henrik's thigh, and Henrik knelt and put his arms around the dog and did not trust himself to speak for a long time. "Let me ask you something. Have you ever had someone stand in front of you and bet publicly that you would fail? Not a whispered doubt, not a private worry. A public wager with money on the table in front of witnesses because your failure was that certain in their eyes? If you have, then you know what Henrik carried home that day. And if you have, you also know that the only thing harder than failing after such a bet is succeeding and still having to live in the same town as the man who made it. Hold on to that feeling. We will come back to Cornelius Lindstrom before we are done. The stove appeared on the 12th of November. Henrik walked into the Lindstrom store because there was no other store in Okanto, and he needed a stove or he would freeze in his finished cabin. A departing settler was selling everything he could not carry east. The stove was a small box stove, rusted at the joints, cracked along one seam. $3, the settler said. Henrik had 73 cents. I can give you 2 days of labor come spring, Henrik said. Any clearing, fencing, hauling you need. The settler looked at him, at the hollow cheeks, at the cracked hands, at the clothes that hung off his frame. Dead man's labor is worth nothing. Cornelius Lindstrom watched from behind his counter. He did not speak. He did not need to speak. His face held a smile that was not a smile. The bell over the door jangled. Einar Dahlberg walked in with a list in his hand. He saw Henrik. He saw the stove. He saw the settler's face. He walked over without hesitation and put his hand on Henrik's shoulder. 3 days of my own labor guaranteed, Einar said to the settler. If this man cannot pay come spring, I will, on my word as a Dahlberg. The settler looked at Einar. He knew Dahlberg. Everyone knew Dahlberg. He was the man whose word had bought him 40 acres free and clear from a widow who trusted him to pay her over 3 years. Your word is worth less than this stove, Dahlberg, Cornelius said from the counter. Einar did not turn. He spoke to the settler as if Cornelius had not spoken at all. 3 days. Come spring, on my word. The settler took it. Henrik carried the cast-iron stove 3 miles home. His shoulders bled under its weight. Bjorn walked at his side, and behind them, Cornelius Lindstrom watched from the store window until they were out of sight, and he was not smiling anymore. On the 4th of November, Henrik ran out of lime. He had one wall remaining, the north wall, the wall that would face the worst of the winter wind. He thinned his remaining supply with extra sand. The mortar was weaker this way. He knew it, could feel it in the way it spread, but weaker mortar was better than no mortar. He worked 18 hours a day, resting only when his hands shook too badly to hold around. On November 10th, he laid the last round on the last course of the north wall. The cabin was closed, but closed was not finished. The door he built from cedar planks he hewed with his axe, joined with wooden pegs because he could not afford nails, leather hinges cut from his own belt, a rope latch that could be pulled from either side. The windows he could not afford to glaze. Glass cost money, and his money was gone. Instead, he stretched oiled paper over the frames. Paper soaked in lard, translucent but not transparent. It let in light, but not sight. On November 15th, Henrik lit his stove for the first time. The chimney drew well. Smoke poured out the top and the cabin filled with warmth. Henrik stood in the center of his 12 by 16-foot cabin, his cordwood cabin, his woodpile house, his impossible accomplishment, and felt the heat seep into his bones. Bjorn walked the perimeter of the single room, sniffing each wall, and finally settled by the stove with a sigh that contained 3 months of waiting. Outside, the temperature was 22 degrees. Inside, his thermometer, a gift from Hannah Dahlberg delivered with the potatoes, read 51. 29 degrees of difference. The walls were holding. But November was not the test. November was warm compared to what was coming. Now, a question for you before we move on. Do you think these walls can hold at 40 below zero? Do you think 16 inches of wood and mortar and sawdust can keep a man and a dog alive when the air itself wants to kill them? Think about your answer. Because what is about to come across the Dakota Territory headed for Wisconsin is not a storm. It is not a cold snap. It is the blizzard of January 7th, 1873, and it will kill more than 70 people in the upper Midwest before it is done. Henrik met Steen Halvorsen on the 3rd of December. Steen was 31, unmarried, Norwegian by blood and alone by choice. He lived in a sod house 3 miles east. The walls were earth. The roof was earth. The floor was earth-packed by boot heels. Henrik had walked past the place twice on his way to cut cedar from a stand further east, and both times he had wanted to say something, and both times he had not known what to say. On the 3rd of December, he said it. He found Sten stacking firewood outside the sod hut. Perhaps a cord. Maybe less. The man was whistling, a cheerful sound against the gray sky. Halvorsen. Solberg, I heard about you, the Woodpile house. They say you did not die in October like Thorvald Knutsen said you would. I did not. Stan grinned. Good for you, good for the Norwegians. Henrik looked at the sod hut, at the thin roof, at the door that did not quite fit its frame, at the firewood pile that was not enough for what was coming. Sten, if a bad storm comes, not a normal storm, a real one, walk to Knutsen's farm, 4 miles. Do not wait. Sten laughed. I have survived 2 winters in this sod, Solberg. I will survive a 3rd. A sod hut can fail. I have been reading. Nobody tells a Halvorsen when to run. Henrik looked at him. Bjorn, beside him, made a low sound, not a growl, closer to a whine. The dog was looking at Sten, and there was something in his gaze that Henrik would remember later, when there was no one left to warn. If the wind comes from the northwest, Henrik said quietly, walk. Do not wait to see what happens. Walk before the sky goes white. My cabin is closer than Knutsen's. 3 miles. Come to me if you have to. Steen clapped him on the shoulder. Norwegians survive, Solberg. That is what we do. Henrik walked home with Bjorn at his heel and a feeling in his chest he could not name. By the middle of December, Henrik had 3.5 cords of firewood stacked against the north wall of his cabin. 6 was safe. 8 was comfortable. He had half of what he needed. But the walls were holding. Outside, the snow piled higher. The stumps disappeared beneath white drifts. Bjorn learned to bound through the snow like a deer, and at night, the dog curled against Henrik's feet under the wool blanket Hannah Dahlberg had also sent with the potatoes, a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke in another woman's hands. Christmas came and went. The Woodpile house did not collapse, and Henrik whispered to Bjorn in the dark, She would have loved you, Ingrid. She always wanted a dog. She said a house without a dog was just a building. Bjorn's tail thumped against the floor twice, then stopped. What Henrik did not know was that 200 miles northwest, over the Dakota Territory, the coldest air mass in living memory was beginning to form. It was a wall of death moving slowly south and east, and it would reach Oconto County on the afternoon of January 7th, and it would not care how well a man had built his walls, only whether his walls had been built well enough. On the morning of January 6th, 1873, Henrik Solberg woke to strange warmth. The temperature outside his cabin had risen overnight. His thermometer read 35. Practically balmy. The snow on his roof began to drip. Water ran in rivulets down his walls, pooling at the foundation. Bjorn would not eat his breakfast. The dog stood by the western window, the oiled paper turning gold in the morning sun, and he stared out at the horizon as if he could see something Henrik could not. His ears were flat. His tail was low. When Henrik spoke to him, the dog did not turn. Bjorn, what is it? The dog made a sound deep in his throat. It was not a growl. It was the sound of an animal sensing something beyond the edge of the world. Henrik went outside anyway, because mild weather was a gift, and his firewood supply was down to 3 cords, and he needed every day of mild weather to cut more. The sky was clear. The sun was bright. The warmth felt like a benediction. He worked for 3 hours, splitting cedar and stacking it against the cabin wall, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he looked up from his chopping. The horizon had disappeared. The wall of white came from the northwest, moving faster than any storm Henrik had ever seen. One moment the sky was clear, the sun bright on melting snow. The next, the tree line vanished, swallowed whole as if God had drawn a curtain across the world. Then the stumps disappeared. Then the woodpile 30 feet away. Then his own hands raised before his face. He dropped his axe and ran. The wind hit him before he reached the door. Not a gust, a force, a physical thing with weight and malice. It shoved him sideways, tore at his coat, drove ice crystals into every gap in his clothing. The temperature was already plummeting. He could feel it on his exposed skin. The balmy morning replaced by something that burned with cold. Snow drove horizontally, filling his eyes, his nose, his mouth. 10 steps to the cabin, maybe 12. He had walked this path 1,000 times in 4 months. He knew exactly where the door was. He ran anyway, one arm raised against the wind, the other groping ahead like a blind man. His boot caught on something. A stump buried under yesterday's snow, invisible now beneath the new fall. He pitched forward. His left arm struck the woodpile first. The logs were stacked waist-high. Split cedar and oak, edges sharp as chisels. His forearm hit edge-on, and the pain was immediate, enormous. A white flash that matched the white world around him. He felt the flesh part, felt the warmth of blood against the cold of wind. He scrambled up, blood on the snow, bright red against white, already vanishing under fresh accumulation. His arm screamed when he moved it. Something was very wrong. Torn muscle, maybe tendon, maybe worse, but he could not stop, could not think. The cabin was somewhere ahead, and outside the cabin was death. 3 more steps, 4, 5. His outstretched right hand struck wood, the door frame, solid cedar, exactly where it should be. He found the rope latch by feel, yanked it with numb fingers, and fell inside. Bjorn was at the door already, barking, frantic. As the wind tried to tear the door from Henrik's grip, the dog braced his body against it from the inside, and together they forced it shut. The rope latch caught. The howling muted to a roar, still deafening, but no longer inside his skull. Henrik lay on the dirt floor of his cabin, bleeding, gasping, snow melting into mud beneath him. Bjorn stood over him, licking his face, whining, his whole body trembling. Outside, the world had ended. Inside, the stove still held embers from the morning fire, glowing orange in the sudden darkness. He was alive. He was sheltered. And the real test had just begun. The gash ran from elbow to wrist, a diagonal slash across the meat of his forearm, deep enough to show pale tissue beneath the welling blood. He could move his fingers. That meant the tendons were intact, or mostly intact. He could bend his elbow. The bone was probably whole, but the blood was coming fast. Every heartbeat pushed more out. He did not have time to be careful. Henrik tore a strip from his spare shirt with his teeth and his working hand, wrapped it around the wound, pulled tight, tighter, until the pressure made white spots dance in his vision. The bleeding slowed, soaked through the cloth, did not drip. It would have to be enough. His ribs announced themselves when he tried to sit up. Left side, low, where he had hit the woodpile after his arm. Not the grinding agony of a break. He had felt broken ribs before. But something close. Cracked, maybe. Breathing hurt. Moving hurt. The stove needed wood. He crawled to it, Bjorn beside him every inch, and fed the embers with kindling. His right hand trembled. Shock, cold, pain, all 3. He dropped the first stick twice before it caught, then larger pieces. building the fire back to something that could hold against what was coming. The cabin temperature had dropped while he was outside. His thermometer read 38 degrees. Firewood inside the cabin, 1/4 cord. At survival burn rate, 4 days. Firewood outside, 3 cords stacked against the north wall. Distance from door to woodpile, 30 feet. Visibility outside, 0. Temperature outside, dropping by the minute. The first night was the longest of his life. The temperature outside dropped past 0 as darkness fell. Past 10 below by midnight. Past 20 below by the small hours when even the wolves stopped howling because the cold had driven them to shelter. The wind never stopped. 70 miles per hour, gusting higher. A constant assault that made the cabin creak and groan like a ship in a gale. Snow piled against the north wall. He could not see it, but he could feel it. The growing weight pressing against the logs and mortar. The cabin held. At 25 below, with wind that could freeze exposed skin in 3 minutes, his interior temperature read 39 degrees. Cold enough to see his breath hanging in the air. Cold enough to keep him from anything resembling sleep, but above freezing. Above the point where water turned to ice, where blood slowed, where a man's heart simply stopped. Henrik fed the stove every 2 hours. By the feel of the fire. When the heat faded enough that he could feel the cold creeping back, he added wood. 1 log, sometimes 2, never 3. 3 was waste. His left arm was useless. The wound had clotted, but the flesh was swollen and hot to the touch. Infection setting in despite the cold. Everything had to happen with his right hand, alone. Bjorn pressed against his side all night. The dog's heat was a small miracle. Henrik talked to him in a low voice. About Norway, about his grandfather's stories, about Ingrid and her black hair, and how she had once laughed so hard at a farmer's joke that she had fallen off a bench in a tavern in Bergen. Bjorn listened the way dogs listen, which is to say with his whole body. By midnight, Henrik had used half his inside wood. 12 logs remained. By dawn, gray light filtering through oiled paper windows, he had used 3/4. 8 logs remained. Outside, the wind still howled. The snow still drove. The temperature had dropped to 32 below. At his current rate, he would burn through the last log by midday. And then the fire would die. And then he would die. The morning brought a choice. Stay inside. Feed his remaining logs one by one. Stretch them as far as they would go. Hope the storm ended before the fire did. Or go outside, 30 feet to the woodpile, in 0 visibility, in 70-mile-per-hour winds, in temperatures that had dropped to 34 below 0, with 1 working arm, with ribs that screamed every time he moved. It was not a choice. It was mathematics. He had rope, 1 coil, 50 feet, purchased months ago for raising his roof beams. He tied one end to the doorframe with a knot that would not slip. Then he knotted the rope at arm-length intervals. Markers he could count by touch. A lifeline. The woodpile was north of the door. 30 feet. If he kept the wind at his back, if the wind stayed from the northwest, he would find it. If the wind shifted, if he lost his grip on the rope, if he fell and could not rise. He did not think about those things. He wrapped his face in every scrap of cloth he could find. The wool scarf Ingrid had knitted 3 winters ago. Linen strips torn from his spare shirt. A piece of canvas that still smelled of sawdust and lime. Bjorn watched him wrap. The dog's eyes were wide, knowing. "Stay, Bjorn," Henrik said. "Stay warm. I need you here when I come back. Guard the fire." Bjorn barked once. Sharp. It was a refusal. When Henrik opened the door, the dog pushed through first. "No, Bjorn, stay!" But the wind took the words, and the dog was already out, already a gray shape in the white, already barking to be followed. Henrik followed. 3 steps. He could see nothing. Absolutely nothing. The snow was not falling. It was flying horizontal, a river of ice that scoured every inch of exposed skin. The cold was so intense it felt like burning. His lungs seized on the first breath. The air was too cold. He coughed, gasped, forced himself to breathe shallowly through the layers of cloth. 5 steps. The rope slid through his right hand, knot by knot, each one a marker. He could hear Bjorn barking ahead, short, sharp, regular, every 3 seconds. The dog was leading him. Henrik followed the sound more than the rope. 8 steps, 12, 15. The wind was shoving him sideways. Only the rope kept him oriented. 18 steps. His right hand struck something solid. Wood, stacked wood, buried under snow, but unmistakably the woodpile. He had found it. Bjorn had found it. Bjorn had led him to it. The dog was already at his side, pressing against his leg, still barking. Snow had covered half the stack. A drift 6 feet high against the north wall, packed hard by the wind. But the upper logs were exposed, crusted with ice, but not buried. Henrik grabbed a log. The cold had stiffened his fingers, slowed his reactions. He forced them to close, tucked the log under his arm, reached for another. His fingers would not fully cooperate. Frostbite, the beginning of it. He grabbed a second log, a third, wedged them against his chest with his useless left arm, ignoring the scream of his ribs. 4 logs, 5, all he could carry. He turned and followed the rope back. The return was longer, fighting the wind instead of riding it. He counted knots, 15, 12, 10. At 10 knots, he stumbled, the same stump, or another just like it. He went down. The logs scattered, tumbling into the snow, vanishing in the white. For a moment, he considered staying down, lying in the snow, letting the cold take him, ending the pain in his arm and his ribs and his frozen face. It would be easy, so easy. Then he thought of Cornelius Lindstrom's smile, the gold-capped tooth. He was not going to die and prove Cornelius right. He felt for the logs by touch, fingers screaming. Found one, found another, gathered them against his chest, forced himself upright. Bjorn was barking from ahead, had kept barking the whole time, was showing him the way home. 7 knots, 5, 3. The door appeared from the white like a vision, dark rectangle in the howling void. His cabin, still standing. He fell through it, dumping the logs on the floor, kicking the door shut behind him as Bjorn squeezed through beside him. The silence was shocking. Not true silence. The wind still roared, but silence compared to outside. Henrik lay on the floor, gasping, snow melting beneath him. Bjorn lay beside him, one of the dog's ears blistered with frostbite, the tip bleeding. Henrik put his hand on the dog's head and the dog pressed into it. "Good dog," he whispered. "Good dog. Good dog." They did not move for an hour. On the 3rd day, the wind died. It happened so gradually that Henrik did not notice at first. The roar faded to a howl, the howl to a moan, the moan to a whisper. The constant pressure against the north wall eased. The cabin stopped creaking. By noon, the snow was falling straight down, vertical, gentle, almost peaceful. The blizzard was over. Henrik opened his door. The world outside was unrecognizable. Snow lay chest-high against the north side of his cabin. His woodpile was a white mound. The stumps that dotted his 40 acres had vanished entirely. The temperature was 28 below zero. Not safe, but survivable. Bjorn stepped out beside him. The dog's frostbitten ear would scar, but the dog was alive. They were both alive. 3 miles east, Sten Halverson was not. Steen had survived the first wave of the storm, the initial assault that drove Henrik inside. But on the second day, when the wind dropped briefly, when the sun almost broke through for an hour, Stan had looked at his dwindling firewood pile and made a fatal mistake. He had thought the worst was over. He had set out to reach a neighbor, to find safety in numbers, to share a fire. The second wave caught him 100 yards from his own door. They found him in March, when the snow melted. He had walked only 100 yards before the cold and the confusion took him down. His arms were raised, as if he had been reaching for something. A door, a fire, a voice calling him home. He was 31 years old. Henrik Solberg would carry that 100 yards with him for the rest of his life. He would wonder, for the rest of his life, whether if he had said it differently, or said it louder, or stayed until Sten had agreed, whether a Norwegian would have come to live instead of die. But Sten had his own pride and his own God, and some 100 yards are longer than any man can close with words. On the last day of January, Henrik heard the rhythmic crunch of snowshoes. He opened the door. Bjorn stood at his side. Thorvald Knudsen was coming from the west. The big man moved slowly, carefully, picking his path through drifts that still reached chest-high in places. His face was drawn. His eyes were red. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in weeks. He stopped 10 feet from the cabin. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring. His eyes moved over the walls, the cordwood walls, the mortared rounds with their ends protruding slightly, creating a textured surface unlike any building in the county. He looked at the snow piled against the north side, nearly to the eaves. He looked at the chimney, trickling smoke. He looked at the door and the man standing in it, at the dog with the scarred ear. "I came," Thorvald said, "to find a body. I came to bury a Norwegian brother. I am not dead, Thorvald." Thorvald walked closer. He circled the cabin slowly, studying it from every angle. When he reached the north wall, the wall that had taken the blizzard's worst punishment, he stopped, removed his mittens, pressed his bare palm against the mortared surface. His eyebrows rose. "It is warm," he said. "The wall is warm. The wood holds the heat." Thorvald pushed against the wall. A hard shove. The kind of force that would reveal weakness. The wall did not move, did not flex, did not groan or shift. He walked the full perimeter, examining joints, testing mortar, studying. When he came back to the front, his face held something Henrik had never seen there before. Not respect exactly. More like the expression of a man whose world had shifted, whose certainties had crumbled. "How much wood did you burn?" Thorvald asked. "During the storm?" "1 cord, perhaps a little more." "1 cord." The words came flat, empty of the emotion that should have accompanied them. "We burned 4 cords in 5 days. Gerda's feet will not be right again, not fully. The doctor said she will walk, but she will walk with pain for the rest of her life. My son lost the feeling in 2 fingers on his right hand. It is coming back, slowly, slowly. The doctor is not sure if it will come back entirely." Silence stretched between them. The sun was bright on the snow. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. The first bird sound Henrik had heard in days. "I have lived in this county 15 years, Thorvald said. "I have buried 2 brothers to this cold. I came to this land with 12 men in a wagon train, and there are now 3 of us left. I told you that a man alone could not raise walls before the freeze. I told you that you would die out there. I told you that no one would find your body until spring." He stopped. He looked at the cabin, then at the dog, then at Henrik. "You did not die. My wife's feet will never be right again. Sten Halverson is lying in the Okanto mortuary because he did not listen to you when you told him to come to me. He told Gerda what you said. She remembered your words after the storm ended. She told me this morning, and I walked 4 miles in the snow to see if the Norwegian was still alive. And he is, and he burned 1 cord of wood. 1 cord. I burned 4. His voice broke. I was wrong, Henrik. I have been wrong about many things in my life, but I have never been more wrong than I was about you. And I have come to ask you on behalf of my wife who will never walk without pain again, and on behalf of my sons who need land because the good timber is gone. Will you teach us? Will you teach my sons how to build what you have built? Henrik did not speak for a long moment. He was thinking of Ingrid. He was thinking that she would have cried to hear such words from such a man. He was thinking that some walls hold heat, and some walls hold pain, and that the hardest walls to break are the ones a man builds inside himself. Come inside, Thorvald, he said. You are tired. You walked 4 miles. Sit by my stove. Thorvald came inside. He saw the small box stove, the rusted one Einar Dahlberg had vouched for. He saw the thermometer on the wall. He asked what it read, and Henrik checked. 44 degrees. Outside, it was 15 below. A difference of 59 degrees. With that stove, that small, cracked $3 stove, Thorvald sat down on the floor because Henrik had only 1 chair, and he put his face in his hands, and he did not speak for a very long time. Bjorn walked over and laid his head on Thorvald's knee, and the big man rested 1 scarred hand on the dog's skull, and a tear fell onto Bjorn's fur, and the dog did not move. Do you think Cornelius Lindström deserved forgiveness? Or do you think, like Henrik, that there are some men who do not need to be forgiven out loud, because the world itself will teach them in its own time? Think about that. Because Henrik is about to face Cornelius again, and what he will do may surprise you. Henrik walked into the Lindström store on the 4th of April, 1873, with money in his pocket for the first time since July of 1872. He had earned it that winter. After the blizzard, Thorvald had hired him by the day. $1 a day. Repairs to the Knutsen cabin, replacing failed chinking, shoring up the sod where it had sagged under the weight of snow. Einar Dahlberg had hired him for fence work. Father Gustav had hired him to cut firewood for the widow Bergquist, though Henrik suspected that particular arrangement had been the priest's idea and not the widow's. By April, Henrik had $32 to his name. He came into the store for flour and salt. Cornelius Lindström watched him from behind the counter. The gold-capped tooth was not showing today. 1 storm, Cornelius said as Henrik counted his coins. 1 storm proves nothing. Any fool can stack firewood once. Henrik did not look up. Knutsen's chinking failed, he said quietly. His wife will walk with pain for the rest of her life. Sten Halverson is dead. His sod hut did not save him. Your 3 cows froze in the chains of your own barn. Your hired man lost 2 fingers trying to open a door you did not help him open. I burned 1 cord of wood. I am standing here. He finished counting, slid the coins across the counter. Count the cost, Lindström. Cornelius went red, then pale. Get out of my store. Henrik picked up his flour. He paused at the door. He turned back. I will not call you a fool. I have known one, and she died last year in a boarding house in Menominee. I do not waste the word. He walked out. Cornelius Lindström never built a cordwood cabin. He never admitted Henrik was right. He never spoke to Henrik again, except in the clipped, minimal exchanges that business required. But he also never again offered to buy Henrik's land for $8. The Woodpile house stood as its own argument. And even Cornelius Lindström could not argue with walls that had held through 41 below. Magnus Dahlberg was 16 years old when he arrived at Henrik's cabin in February of 1873, with his father riding behind him on a borrowed horse. He was tall for his age, but still gangly, not yet grown into his adult frame. He stared at the cordwood cabin the way a young man stares at something that has changed his understanding of the world. "I want to learn," Magnus said before his father could speak. "I want to build like this." Henrik looked at Einar, who shrugged. The boy has spoken of nothing else since the blizzard ended. He wants land of his own. He wants to build. "Send him," Henrik said. "We begin with mortar." Magnus came every day that spring and summer. He learned how to choose wood, how to debark it, how to stack it for drying. He learned how to burn lime, how to slake it, how to mix it with sand and sawdust. He learned the two-bead technique, the sawdust fill, the way end grain sheds water. By June, Erik Magnus Dahlberg had a cabin of his own on 40 acres adjacent to Henrik's land. By the end of 1875, there were 12 cordwood cabins in Oconto County and Door County. By 1890, there were over 60 in the state. Henrik never charged a fee. Hannah Dahlberg asked him why, once, in her kitchen while her husband loaded their wagon. "Einar gave me potatoes when I had none," Henrik said. "Your word bought my stove. Thorvald's wife remembered my words and saved her husband's faith in me. This is how I repay." Hannah nodded slowly. She understood debts like that. Everyone on the frontier understood debts like that. Anna Bergquist attended a church social at the Dahlberg farm in the spring of 1876. She came with Lars, now 13 and serious, and Birgitta, now 11 and still fearless. Birgitta spotted Bjorn from across the yard and was at his side in 6 strides, her arms around his neck. "Mr. Bjorn, I have missed you." Bjorn's tail thumped against the grass. Anna walked more slowly. She wore a blue dress she had owned for 7 years and a shawl that had been her mother's. Her wheat-colored hair was pinned up properly, but one strand had escaped at the temple. "Mr. Solberg." "Mrs. Bergquist." They stood apart for a moment. Then Hannah Dahlberg, who had eyes for everything, called out that the coffee was ready, and both of them had an excuse to walk in the same direction. Over the coffee, they spoke of Norway, of the way the light came in at an angle across the fjords, of 1,000 small things that neither of them had spoken of to anyone in years. Anna said, "My husband was a good man, but quiet. I used to wonder if I would ever hear another voice speak gently in my house again." Henrik said, "I buried my wife with $12. I could not afford a headstone. I still cannot forgive myself for that." Anna set down her cup. She reached across the table. She placed her hand on his for one brief moment. "She would not want you to carry that. No good woman would." Henrik looked at her, at the wheat-field eyes, at the hand that had touched his. In October of 1876, Henrik Solberg and Anna Bergquist were married in the Lutheran church in Oconto. Father Gustaf Olafsson, who had once told Henrik the old ways would not cross the sea, performed the service. He wept during the vows. Birgitta Bergquist, now 12 years old, held Bjorn's collar at the back of the church so that the dog did not run up the aisle. Bjorn ran up the aisle anyway. Everyone laughed. In the spring of 1878, Henrik took a wagon to Menominee. He had saved $16 over the winter. He bought a gray granite headstone. He had it carved with Ingrid's name, and her dates, and the words, "Her husband remembers." He took the headstone to the paupers' cemetery. The caretaker, an old German, walked with him to the unmarked graves and helped him find the row where Ingrid had been buried. Henrik set the stone himself. He stood there for an hour. Anna had told him to take whatever time he needed. She had not come. This was not her place. This was Ingrid's place. Anna understood that a man could love 2 women without dividing himself. She understood that the dead do not compete with the living. When Henrik walked back to the wagon, Bjorn was waiting. "She would have loved you," Henrik told the dog. She always wanted a dog. In 1879, Henrik built a larger house for his family. 20 by 24 feet. Cordwood walls, 16 inches thick, mortared inside and out with sawdust fill in the middle. Magnus Dahlberg helped, and 4 of Henrik's other students helped, and the house went up in a single summer. The original cabin became a workshop. Henrik used it for tools and lumber storage. Anna used it for preserving. Lars Bergquist, now 16, built his own cordwood house on land adjacent to his stepfather's in 1883. Birgitta Bergquist married Magnus Dahlberg in 1886, and they moved into a cordwood cabin Magnus had built himself. In 1884, Bjorn began to slow. He was 14, old for a Norwegian elk hound. His back legs weakened first. Henrik built a small wooden cart on wheels and rigged it with a harness so that Bjorn could still accompany him to the fields. The dog rode in it like a king. In February of that year, Bjorn could not stand one morning. Henrik carried him to the bed. He covered him with the wool blanket Hanna Dahlberg had sent 12 years earlier, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar. Anna sat on one side of the bed. Henrik sat on the other. Lars and Birgitta came from their own homes. Bjorn's breathing grew slow. Henrik stroked the dog's head through the long night. He did not sleep. He talked to Bjorn about Norway, and about Ingrid, and about the blizzard, and about the 100 yards that had killed Sten Halvorsen, and about the way Bjorn had led him back through the snow with a bark every 3 seconds, a sound Henrik would hear in his dreams for the rest of his life. Bjorn died at dawn. Henrik buried him near the original cabin, the Woodpile house. He carved a cedar marker with his own hands. Bjorn, a true friend. He led me through the storm. He never got another dog. Henrik Solberg died on the 3rd of November, 1894. Pneumonia. He had worked in a cold rain in October. The cough that followed would not break. Anna nursed him for 3 weeks. Dr. Hansen came from Oconto twice and shook his head both times. On the last morning, Anna moved his chair to the window so that he could see the 40 acres he had bought for $12. The land was no longer stumps. It was fields, hayfields, gold in the November sun, a white horse in the near pasture, smoke from the chimney of Lars Bergquist's cordwood cabin across the creek. Henrik looked at the land. He looked at Anna. He squeezed her hand. "I did not fail her," he said. "Tell Ingrid, if you meet her, tell her I did not fail her." "I will tell her, Henrik." He died as the sun crossed noon. He was 54 years old. They buried him beside Ingrid in Oconto. Anna had arranged it years earlier. She had moved Ingrid's body from the Paupers Cemetery in 1878. The same spring Henrik had bought the headstone. She had never told him. It had been her gift to him for after. Anna Bergquist Solberg lived another 12 years in the house Henrik built. She died in her sleep in 1906, surrounded by grandchildren. She was buried on Henrik's other side. 3 stones, 1 family. Bjorn's grave was moved when the old cabin was finally torn down in 1912 after a lightning strike burned part of the roof. Lars Bergquist moved the cedar marker to the family plot and set it at the foot of Henrik's grave. He led me through the storm. The larger cordwood house stood for another 20 years after Anna's death. Grandchildren visited. When progress finally demanded something newer, when the old house was torn down to make way for a modern structure, the workers who demolished it marveled at what they found. The mortar had not cracked. The wood had not rotted. After more than 50 years, the walls were still solid. They did not understand what they were destroying. They did not know the story of the man who built it. In 1978, a landscape architecture professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison named William Tischler began documenting cordwood structures across the state. He found approximately 90 surviving 19th-century cordwood buildings. He traced construction techniques, measured wall thickness, tested thermal performance. His research showed that a properly built 16-inch cordwood wall with mortar beads on both faces and sawdust fill in the center achieved thermal resistance equivalent to modern fiberglass insulated walls with vapor barriers. The principle behind it, he wrote, was the same principle modern passive house architects would rediscover in Germany in the 1990s. Two thermal barriers separated by a cavity of dead air as insulator, the wall as breathing membrane, end grain as water shedder. Everything Henrik's grandfather had taught him in Sädesdal, validated by calibrated instruments a century later. Tischler, in his papers, referenced a family named Dahlberg. He had interviewed an elderly woman, Birgitta Dahlberg Carlson, in the 1970s. She had remembered being a small girl and meeting a Norwegian man and his dog at the Lutheran church. She remembered that the dog had sad eyes. She remembered that the man had built a house from firewood when people said he would die, and that her stepfather had been that man, and that he had taught her husband's father how to build walls that do not forget. Henrik Solberg taught my father Magnus, her testimony read in Tischler's notes. My father taught my husband. My husband taught our son. The walls do not forget. Let me leave you with one final question, and then I will set this story down. Whose voice in your life told you that something was impossible? Who stood in front of you and said with certainty that you would fail? And when did you prove them wrong? Tell me in the comments below. I would like to know. I think Henrik Solberg would have liked to know too. He was the kind of man who read comments, if they had existed in his time. He was the kind of man who believed that every person who had ever been told they were a fool for trying something new carried a piece of his own story inside them. He had $4. He had no neighbors within 3 miles. He had timber no one else would touch, and he built a house that stood for 63 years, and a family that stood longer, and a legacy of walls across 100 acres of Wisconsin that still stand today. The old ways had crossed the sea after all. They had only been waiting for a man desperate enough to remember them. And for a dog, a gray Norwegian elk hound named Bjorn, who led him through the storm, and whose cedar marker still sits, weather-worn but legible, in a family plot on 40 acres that were once called the Graveyard of Fools. A true friend. He led him through the storm. And he led all of us, who still live in warm houses on cold nights, home.